welcome to the Jack Westin MCAT podcast with your host, Ahmed
and Eric Olson.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Jack Westin MCAT podcast with Ahmed and Eric. Today, we'll be looking at genetics, both Mendelian genetics and population genetics with Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium and stuff like that. But before we get started, I'll turn it over to Eric for any updates in derm world.
I don't know if I have any exciting updates for you, honestly. I'm just living the life. My daughter was sick this last week, so I was taking care of her. And like you go through medical school, and so you learn all like the worst things. And it was weird because she like threw up one night, and then she went like 4 days and was like completely fine, was like not acting weird at all, was eating fine. And then she threw up again like 4 days later, and then she threw up again the next day. So I was like, just like the time course was really weird,
Right.
Things that I'm familiar with, I guess. And so at that point, like I got worried. And so I called my friend who's a pediatrician, and he was like, oh yeah, like probably is nothing, but keep an eye on it. And then I called this other guy that I know who's a pediatric gastroenterologist. I mean, it's nice to know people, right? And he similarly was like, she's probably fine. It's probably just like, either like kind of an atypical virus, or sometimes when you have like a GI bug, and this actually happened to me once, but sometimes like after you have like the active, like nausea, vomiting, diarrhea sorts of symptoms, you can get like your gut kind of slows down. It's called post-viral gastroparesis, where like, at least my experience with it was like I couldn't eat too much, or I couldn't eat too fast, or like it just wouldn't go. Like I would eat a meal and I would feel full for like 24 hours because it just like wasn't moving at all.
Yeah.
And so anyway, he was like, oh, it could be this, like it could be that. And she's been fine since then. So that's been like occupying a lot of my mind space, which is kind of hard because like you have so much to do and so much to learn, and you're like trying to take care of your own family. And
Right.
But you were just telling me that you're on vacation this week.
It's not quite vacation. Yeah, I'm back home with my family, but it was a roller coaster. 60 hours from AM Thursday to afternoon Saturday. So I'll get to the end of the story and then rewind. But end of the story is I went to bed at 6 p.m. on Saturday, and I woke up at 9:30 Sunday morning. So that's how the story ended.
Sounds like catching up on things.
Catching up on a lot of REM sleep for sure. Rewinding a little bit. So for context, Friday, which would have been October 18th, was the last day of my first course of med school. So we had our last exam, which wasn't cumulative. It was just another 25% exam. I had passed the first three at this point. And so as long as I got above a 60, which meant I didn't have to retake that exam, I'm good. And so given that sort of leeway, there was a pro squash tournament in Quebec. So I'm not sure how in tune everyone's geography is, but it was about a 4.5 hour drive. Now, I have Wednesdays off, so the smart move would have been go up on the Wednesday, stay the night, play, come back if I lost, or stay if I won.
Sure.
Now, I'm on a student budget, so I was like, yeah, I don't want to pay for the Airbnb. I'll go up day of. Mistake. Like trying to compete at a high level after driving for 4.5 hours, not compatible. But
so it didn't go great.
Yeah, I didn't play well. I don't think even if I had gone up the day before that it would have made any difference. And for context, like whether I lose by a lot or lose by a little, I get the same number of points and I get the same amount of prize money. So unless I win, that's the only time in which anything changes.
Sure.
So really for me, and it's not a great mindset, but like it was a business trip. I was there, get points, go home. Because the way, and not to go too far on a tangent, but like the more points you have, the higher your ranking. And the way it works is your points are calculated by your points from your 11 best tournaments of the past calendar year divided by 11. I turned
Okay.
pro in June, so this was only my fourth
I was
tournament.
gonna say I didn't realize you were like playing professionally, but that's a new thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the problem is I've played four tournaments, but it's still getting divided by 11, which means
Okay.
it's not super representative.
Yeah.
The problem with that is when you sign up for tournaments, only the top, usually 20, get taken. And then there's like four wild cards. So
Hmm.
it's really, really hard to get into tournaments. So anytime you get an opportunity to claim points, you kind of have to take it.
Yeah.
So anyway, I lost. I got back to Toronto at about 1 a.m. Friday morning, having not yet studied about a third of the exam Friday afternoon. So I studied for a little bit. We had clinical skills from 8 to 12 Friday morning. Uh, had the exam from 2 to 3. And then four of us, including myself, had birthdays that week. So we had this big, joint birthday party slash end of first course party. Started at 8, ended at like 2 by the time we were done cleaning up and stuff. And then I had work 8 a.m. Saturday. And then I finished work around 6 and or around 5, and I was knocked out by 6. So this week has been good to just get a lot of sleep, get a lot of just relaxed work
Are you
done.
staying at home? Do you have to drive home after all that? Or is
So
are you
yeah, I drove home Saturday, like in between meetings.
yeah. How far is it from school to home?
Hour 15. It's not horrible.
Not as bad as from there to Quebec.
No, not
Yeah.
even remotely. The
Well,
thing about
that's
that,
awesome. That's awesome you're playing pro. That's actually super interesting. And thanks for explaining because I didn't know anything about that. But I'll be interested to hear how future tournaments go and things like that. Next time you'll remember to go up the day before and
yeah, I
rest
mean,
before you play.
as it currently stands, I'm scheduled to play in Ecuador in November. So I'm
Awesome.
still contemplating whether I want to make that trip or not, but it's another opportunity to get more points. So
Yeah.
we'll see.
You gotta play and get points.
Yeah, because like the thing is too, like if once you get a high enough ranking, you start getting first round buys, which means
Mhm.
it's easier to get more
You play
points and
less.
more
And yeah.
prize money. And so like in my head, I'm just like, I'm doing the dirty work now to get an easier run at things later.
Now's the time. First year med school is hard, but you have a little bit more flexibility, with your
Yeah.
schedule and your travel and things like that. So
And it's
I
good
think it'll be smart.
balance. Like it I want to word this carefully, but it's nice to get out of the med school bubble.
Yeah.
It's everyone's not everyone, but like a lot of people will be stressing like shadowing and research and stuff like that. And it's important. Excuse me, it's important. Don't get me wrong, but we have 2 years to shadow. Like
Hmm.
I start next week. Like I'm not really like I'm not
Yeah.
sweating it. But
Yeah.
uh yeah, that's update on my end. Enjoy the week off, but back to reality next week.
Well, enjoy while you can.
Yeah. I'm gonna learn that the hard way, I think. But in any case, genetics wise, um for me when I was studying the MCAT, like it really did fall into excuse me, two big domains. Like we have the Mendelian genetics side of things, and we have like the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium sort of side of things. And honestly, I think they're roughly equal in terms of like frequency of questions. I don't know. Did you see one more than the other when you were studying?
I want to say that I think Mendelian genetics is more relevant. I think even like if you're getting a question on Hardy Weinberg, like I feel like they're kind of really getting into the genetic side of things, whereas like they can kind of peripherally mention some Mendelian type of stuff without getting too deep into it. So I felt like it could be brushed on more. And the other reason to me it was more relevant was because like there's also molecular genetics, right, where you get into kind of more of the specifics of the DNA and mutations and things that we've talked about, right? But I think you can kind of interweave those concepts as well. So I felt like Mendelian genetics had kind of more directions you could go with it and branched out to a lot of different
Right.
topics. Whereas Hardy-Weinberg is kind of like an end in itself, and
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
you don't
No,
branch
that's
off as
fair.
much to other topics.
100%. I think, for anyone who's taken a genetics course, it's certainly not the same depth by any
Hmm.
means. Um, like I don't ever recall like the terms, independent assortment or segregation or any
Yeah.
of those kinds of things. Like occasionally you'll maybe get asked to do a probability, but um to your point, like that's kind of the nice thing about Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium is you're either going to get asked about assumptions or some sort of frequency, whether it was, heterozygous frequency or recessive allele frequency. Um, a bit narrower of a scope. Um, so yeah, maybe diving into Mendelian genetics to start. I'm curious, Eric, like what were sort of the main things that I guess you emphasized while you were studying? And maybe if there's any difference, what things did you end up seeing more on your practice tests?
Yeah. Uh, this is one of those areas like, and I've said before, there are certain things that like I really found interesting. And I took a genetics class, and like the professor who taught it was the coolest professor and very interesting. And I had an interest in genetics to begin with. So and Mendel, like what an interesting guy. He like lived in a monastery and just like grew
Yeah,
people and learned all these things. And then
yeah,
he like published his findings and like no one cared for like decades. And finally
yeah.
like someone dug it up and was like, this is pretty interesting stuff. And now it's like the basis of our understanding of genetics. So just kind of an interesting topic for me. I think the things that are kind of highest yield, in my opinion, as far as genetics goes, is like number one, like what is genetic? Like what are we talking about when we say genetics?
Right.
So I'll get into that in just a second. But the other thing that I think is kind of more concrete is just understanding the differences between inheritance patterns. So autosomal dominant, autosomal recessive, X-linked dominant, X-linked recessive being kind of the main ones to know for the MCAT. And like when we talk about genetics, as far as medicine goes, generally speaking, we're talking about like diseases that occur due to like mutations in the genetic code, right? Like there's some sort of problem with your DNA code that should be encoding some sort of protein or something that is not coded appropriately. And so because of that, like your body is unable to make some gene product that it should be able to make. And so we talk about, genetics and genetic like inheritance patterns of disease and things like that. And a lot of times in classes and in discussions that we have, we talk about it in terms of physical traits and phenotypes, right? But the whole point here is to understand like how does our DNA play into our phenotype, like the way that we look as individuals, the way that we behave, and like diseases that we have, right? So it is super relevant for medicine and for human biology and animal biology and plant biology as well. I think the one other thing that I think is maybe not as relevant for the MCAT per se, but I think is important to understand is the way that we present genetics when we're teaching it in school and things like that is that things are Mendelian in nature, meaning every trait that we have is associated with a single gene. And we talk about like the blue eye or like your eye color gene, right? Like that blue eyes and green eyes are recessive and that brown eyes are dominant. And so it's like this one gene. And if you have one mutation, then it's going to change the way that your eyes look. And in reality, like so much of who we are and the genetic problems that we may experience are due to like lots and lots of genes kind of playing,
Yeah.
being put together in a certain way. So like a lot of diseases that we talk about in skin, for example, like psoriasis or lichen planus, for example, are two that come to mind that people may or may not be familiar with. But a lot of skin diseases we say are kind of an interplay of some of your genes that have come together in a certain way and some of the environmental influences that you've experienced or that you've been exposed to. And so it's not Mendelian per se, like maybe my mom has psoriasis and that doesn't mean that I'm going to get psoriasis. It's like a lot of genes coming together and environmental factors as well that kind of play a role into the kind of disease that we experience. As far as like things that are more relevant for the MCAT, and sorry, that's kind of an aside, but I think it's important to recognize, like moving forward into medicine, that things, even genetic diseases, are not always so kind of cut and dry as you have a gene or you do not have a gene. Um, the main things I think is this discussion of like autosomal and X-linked diseases. And I think you need to understand the inheritance patterns. Like, what is it going to look like? Who in a family is going to be affected by a particular disease based on its inheritance pattern? And part of that is like understanding meiosis and mitosis and like how chromosomes are going to come together. And I think that's kind of a larger discussion that we don't really have to get into at this time. But basically, like if you have the main distinction that we make initially, or I guess you could do it one of two ways. You could say we have dominant versus recessive traits or diseases, as the case may be. And then we have autosomal or X-linked traits or diseases, as the case may be. And so, you could pick your poison of which way you want to discuss, like which way you want to separate it out first. For me, I think about it in terms of, is it autosomal or is it X-linked? Autosomal, and feel free to jump in at any time if you have anything to add on it. But autosomal is like, it is born of any chromosome that's not the X chromosome. Basically, it's not a sex chromosome. And so, we have 23 pairs of chromosomes as humans, so 46 chromosomes in all, one set from mom, one set from dad. All of the chromosomes 1 through 23, or excuse me, 1 through 22 are called autosomal. And so the chromosome that you get from your mother and the chromosome you get from your father are going to match. They look very similar. They have all the same genes. And the 23rd chromosome is either two X's if you're a female or an X and a Y if you're a male. Okay. And so when we talk about an autosomal disease versus an X-linked disease, or trait, I guess, again, I think in terms of disease, because that's what we study in medicine. But an autosomally inherited disease is going to be on one of those chromosomes 1 through 22 versus an X-linked disease, which is going to be on chromosome 23 on the X chromosome. And so once you kind of decide, again, there are specific inheritance patterns that go with each of these, like autosomal versus X-linked diseases. And then once you figure out if it's autosomal or X-linked, you think about it, is it dominant or is it recessive? And so for a dominant disease or trait, you only have to have one copy of that allele in order to have, expressivity of that gene. And so, we mentioned eye color, and I'll use it as an example because I think it's one that people are familiar with. But the idea being like, your eye color is a reflection of the pigment that may or may not be present in the eye. And so if you have brown pigment present in your eye appears brown. And any other color like blue or green is kind of an absence of any pigment. You only need one allele to express brown pigment to have brown eyes. And so that's a dominant trait. You could have a brown eye allele. So I can give an example. My dad has brown eyes and my mom has blue eyes, and I have brown eyes. So my mom would have passed me down a recessive blue allele because she has blue eyes. She has two blue alleles, so to speak. And my dad, I have siblings who have blue eyes. So my dad would have a brown allele and a blue allele, but he passed me a brown. And so because I have one brown allele, then the phenotype that you see is brown irises, brown eyes. And so that would be, again, kind of an autosomal dominant trait, whereas an autosomal recessive has nothing to do with the sex of the patient or the individual, or the gender, or whatever term you prefer. But it is, if you have two recessive alleles, so I have a brother who has blue eyes, and that means that he got a recessive blue allele from my mother and a recessive blue allele from my father.
Just out of curiosity, this is not your twin brother, is it?
No, different brother. Yeah, my twin brother, we have the same genes, right? So,
Okay. I was gonna say that would be peculiar.
Yeah.
Okay.
Then the alternative is this question of like X-linked dominant and X-linked recessive diseases. So X-linked recessive often will only show up in males. Males only have one X chromosome. And so if you have you have a much greater chance of having only one recessive allele versus having two recessive alleles. It takes it's the probabilities are much lower of having two recessive X chromosomes, right? And so if you have some recessive trait that's passed down to a male from a carrier mother, then that will be that could demonstrate an autosomal, or excuse me, an X-linked recessive disease. Versus an X-linked dominant disease, you can see in both males and females. Again, the idea being like the probabilities are much lower for a female to be receiving a recessive X chromosome or a recessive X allele. Excuse me, a
Right.
recessive allele on X chromosome. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Versus
And
a male who only has to have one X chromosome that has that recessive allele.
and it's an interesting point, and I want to preface what I'm about to say by saying this is an aside, and not to worry about this for the MCAT. Like as far as the MCAT is concerned, there is still, X-linked dominant, X-linked recessive, etc. In reality, though, there isn't really an X-linked dominant or recessive, and it comes down to the fact that, as many of our viewers likely will have learned at some point in the past, in the female cell line, right, one of the X chromosomes gets inactivated to sort of balance gene expression between both biological sexes.
Mm-hmm.
And so what happens is, say you have a quote unquote autosomal recessive disease, right? Or sorry, X-linked recessive
X-linked
disease,
recessive.
excuse me.
Yeah.
And so the female cell will have an affected allele and an unaffected allele.
Mm-hmm.
It's not if she expresses, the phenotype, it's really to what extent. And that's determined by the pattern of X chromosome inactivation.
Activation.
And
Yeah.
so,
What is that called when X chromosome is inactivated?
like silencing? I don't
Well, I
know.
was going for bar body. Bar body is
Oh, so
that
yes,
could be relevant.
the inactivated chromosome is called the bar body. You're right. Um, Not to be confused with a polar body, which is sort of the remnant during meiosis of a gamete, or specifically an oocyte. But in any case, and so what's interesting with these X-linked recessive conditions is in females, you'll see these patterns of expression. Um, for example, there was one condition we learned about actually in med school. It was a derm condition, I think. And you could see like streaks of discoloration,
Yeah.
because that's where, the recessive allele was more prominently expressed.
Okay.
But like
Yeah.
other regions of the body are completely fine.
Yeah.
And it also like
Well,
it
that
does the
go ahead.
no, excuse me.
I was gonna say we call that a Blaschkoid distribution. What happens is it's kind of earlier in embryonic development that you have the point
Right.
where one X chromosome is turned off, and then you have a bunch of like daughter cells that come from that lineage, and they distribute themselves in a very characteristic fashion as they kind of migrate down the extremities and down the trunk. And so those cells that are affected, you see them in certain pattern. Was it incontinentia pigmenti? Was that what you were talking about?
Maybe I
Maybe
don't know if
not.
I
Whatever.
I don't know
It
if I was
doesn't
fully
matter.
paying attention at that point, but might
Fair
have been
enough.
2.5 hours into a 3 hour lecture.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
we passed the exam. That's all that matters.
There you go.
Um, but yeah, no, it's interesting how like the applications of X inactivation with an X-linked recessive condition um leads to this idea of variable expressive variable expressivity. But if it's X-linked dominant, like it's not
It's,
really, yeah, there's no variability there. It doesn't
yeah.
matter. Now, granted, in females, the same principle applies where again it depends on the pattern of inactivation. Uh, so really, whether it's dominant or recessive, really only affects the male
Hmm.
phenotype, because inactivation occurs in the female regardless of whether they're a carrier or um, you know homozygous, etc. So
Hmm.
just food for thought. Not something that would come up in the context of the MCAT by any means, but I think it's an interesting concept.
Yeah. These are terms that are actually really relevant. And like you'll do an OB rotation and a peds rotation at some point on that. I remember when I did my OB rotation obstetrics, or I did a couple of weeks with the maternal fetal medicine service, which is like high risk pregnancies of like mothers who are diabetic and have other like health conditions, and then had genetic testing and like something was up with their baby. And like they had genetic counselors in there talking to patients about like genetic stuff and this sort of thing. In dermatology, I had a patient who had come in. There's an autosomal dominant disease called tuberous sclerosis. If you haven't heard about that, then I'm sure you will. It's like a board favorite. And basically, like you develop these kind of benign tumors in different organs and things like that. And one of the ways that they are initially diagnosed and kind of spotted is that they get these kind of benign tumors of the skin and like discolored patches and things like that. And so she had come into our clinic to kind of rule out or for our opinion of whether or not her findings on her skin were consistent with this disease, tuberous sclerosis. And I had never seen it before. And I think the attending I was working with at the time was pretty new, and I don't know if they had seen it before. And so we went into the room kind of interested. It's like something you learn about in school, and it's not super common. And we kind of looked at her skin and did see some lesions that were concerning for this disease. And we kind of, I mean, for lack of a better phrasing, we were kind of excited because we were like, "Oh wow, yeah, this really is tuberous sclerosis." So you can, we'll let your other doctors know. And she was really upset because she was like, I have kids. This is bad news for me because it's an
Right.
autosomal dominant disease. There's a 50% chance that I would have passed the affected allele down to any of my kids. And so that was kind of distressing to her. And it hammered home to me like, this is not just, a factoid that's interesting that we learn about, but it's people's lives, first of all.
Yeah.
And second, it matters to understand how those diseases are passed down and what the inheritance patterns look like so you can prevent.
100%. We had a whole week devoted to medical genetics, talking about, the role geneticist plays and, pregnancy consulting and, screen excuse me, screening. And it's a big, really big deal because it changes people's decisions
Yeah.
about whether they want to get pregnant or not, given the risk, right, of certain conditions. And it's more complicated than a traditional Punnett square, right? Like there's other factors you have to consider because you don't necessarily always have all the details. For example, one case we saw was a 30-something-year-old woman is, concerned about having children because her sister's son, so her nephew, has this condition and their mother has it. And I think it was an autosomal recessive condition. And so, they're you're supposed to advise basically on like what is the likelihood, and you don't actually have all the information.
Yeah.
You know nothing about the father. Father passed away, had no genetic testing done. And even then it gets even more complicated because based on the sort of cultural ancestry, there's these things known as founder variants where certain mutations are more common in certain populations. And so you factor that into account.
Yeah.
And so, it quickly layers in complexity. Um, and so, again, not to get too far off topic, but it's a really intriguing sort of branch of medicine, just the role genetics or geneticists play in advising patients and the number of factors that they have to consider when
Yeah.
advising people on life-changing decisions, right?
Yeah, it's not something that everyone will do, obviously.
100%.
I think that we all will take care of patients who have genetic diseases, and so knowing something about how these things work is important. And I think it's a little bit difficult to kind of explain the nitty-gritty of things that I would be familiar with without drawing it out. But as like I would encourage you to think through each of these inheritance patterns that we've talked about and, draw a Punnett square and get back into that. I think it's relevant. I think it can be helpful. You're not necessarily going to have to draw a Punnett square on the MCAT, but it is certainly possible that there could be a question where it would be helpful. And so understanding this idea of like, if you are a male with an X-linked recessive, disorder, then where did that X chromosome come from? It had to have come from the mother because the mother is passing down an X chromosome, the father is passing down a Y chromosome. So if you have an affected X chromosome, it definitely came from your mother. And that's just an example, but like I would go through those sorts of things for each of these different inheritance patterns. Things like, for example, in an autosomal dominant condition, you'll see individuals who are affected in every generation of a family tree, versus an autosomal recessive condition, you may see individuals who are affected in every other generation. You probably won't see two generations in a row who are affected. And so things like that, I think, can be helpful and can be relevant because sometimes you'll see questions that kind of get at some of those questions. There are a number of other kind of phrases, and you touched on one earlier, Ahmed, which was variable expressivity. Some of those things like incomplete dominance, codominance,
Right.
variable expressivity, incomplete penetrance, things like that. And if you want to get into all of those, we certainly can. I would just touch on one because I have a relevant story, which is there's I guess now that we're like talking about it, I'm realizing how much this really is relevant for dermatology, at least. And there's another dermatologic disease which I certainly wasn't familiar with until like a month and a half ago, so I wouldn't expect anyone else to. But it's called Darier's disease, and you can get these kind of like greasy, crusty bumps on your face, and it can spread to like your trunk and your underarms and things like that. And it is an autosomal dominant condition. And so, like, if you have it and you have a child, then there's a pretty high likelihood that child is going to have a 50%, right? Because you have one autosomal chromosome that is affected, and you're going to pass down one or the other. And this is one that has variable expressivity. And so sometimes, maybe your mother had this disease, Darier's disease, and she had very mild disease, like barely
Right.
had symptoms, was really well controlled with maybe minimal medication, things like that. And then maybe, that person has a child. And this idea of variable expressivity, which I guess I should define if I'm going to talk about it, means that, you you have the disease and you will have phenotypic demonstrations of the disease. So, you're going to have symptoms, so to speak. But variable expressivity, meaning maybe it's really severe and you have a lot of symptoms and a lot of kind of demonstration of that phenotype. Maybe it's kind of a lower severity of disease. So in this example, we had a patient whose mother had very minimal disease, had been well controlled, and then she had very, very severe disease. And so it was this idea that, the expressivity of that disease, of that gene, was different from generation to generation. It doesn't always get more severe per se, but you can have some that are more severe, some that are less severe. And that's one, again, that like, I don't think I saw on every MCAT test, every practice exam that I took. I don't know if I saw it on the MCAT itself, but it's fair game. It's a term that you should be familiar with.
100%. Yeah, I think that really like covers most of the excuse me, getting over a bug, but the Mendelian side of things. I'd be acquainted with the terms variable expressivity, incomplete penetrance. Penetrance meaning like, not everybody actually has it, right? So I think of variable expressivity as like the number of spots different cheetahs have, right? They don't
Mhm.
all have the same number of spots, right? Whereas incomplete penetrance could be like you have a couple of oddball cheetahs with no spots at all,
Yeah.
right? So it's think of incomplete penetrance as like a flicker switch, whereas variable expressivity is like that sliding switch,
Yeah, I
right?
love that.
So, but yeah, like I personally haven't seen those terms come up a whole lot. but good to know sort of
The
nonetheless.
big things are these inheritance patterns. And I don't know,
Yes.
I kind of brought that up and then we've talked about it, but I don't know, do you have other things as far as Mendelian genetics go that you think are big points, important things to know?
Not particularly. Like in undergrad or in high school, you may have heard the terms law of independent assortment, law of segregation. They're not critical with respect to the MCAT, but law of independent assortment is basically just saying that, if you get one copy, like if you get, mom's chromosome 22, that doesn't mean you're getting mom's chromosome 21 or 20 or whatever, right? The
Hmm.
chromosomes assort independently.
Hmm.
And then the law of segregation is basically just saying like you're going to separate the homologous chromosomes during anaphase. But I would say for Mendelian genetics, like you said, Eric, I prioritize the inheritance patterns. And as far as genetics goes on the MCAT, really the only other area to touch on is like the sort of population level genetics with Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, etc. Um, I think it's important to note like Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium is completely hypothetical. Like it's not something that actually exists, but it's a helpful estimate to try to predict certain allele frequencies. And so what Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium is it it makes these five bold assumptions.
Hmm.
These I would know. I've seen MCAT questions test these. Let's see how many of them I remember. But you need a very, very large population.
Hmm.
You want random mating. You want no mutation. So let's, just think about how realistic that is for a second. You want no gene flow, so people moving in or out of the population, and you want no natural selection. So you want a random,
Got
um,
them all.
nice. Yeah. I drilled those into my head senior year
Yeah.
of high school and it just stayed. Sometimes I wish they would leave, but not today. Uh, so yeah, just thinking about those assumptions for a second, the no mutations thing is absolutely impossible. Like
Yeah.
mutations happen in pretty much every cell division, right? No emigration or immigration, like again, physically impossible, right? No natural selection, again, not possible. Um, the random mating and the large population ones, those are fairly, reasonable. But the point being, it
You
is
have to have all five for for these ideas to hold true. And that's
exactly
not very realistic, but it kind of helps us to understand allele frequencies and how they function kind of in a population.
right. And so, um, with those assumptions, we, assume this hypothetical population meets these conditions. There's two equations that are helpful, and they're derived from one another. I want to emphasize this, but basically, let's assume there's only two alleles for a certain gene, which is a bold assumption in and of itself. But in any case,
But
uh,
that's the idea of Mendelian genetics. Or I guess not. Never mind. I take
well,
that.
it's true of Mendelian and it's true of Hardy-Weinberg. Like most genes have more than two alleles,
Yeah. Yeah.
like way more. But in any case, if you were to add the frequency of the dominant allele, which we'll call P, and the recessive allele, which we'll call Q, they would add to one, right? So we've got P plus Q equals one. Okay.
And that makes sense, right? Because you're thinking like, okay, say everyone in a population has like again, this is not Hardy Weinberg, but like if everyone had one dominant and one recessive allele, because everyone's going to have two alleles, right? You have two
Yeah.
chromosomes or two pairs of each given chromosome. Then you'd have 50% of those chromosomes are P or those alleles are P and 50% are Q. And similarly, like if you had 30% of the population had a P allele and 70% had a Q, then you'd have, 0.3 being 30% is P, plus zero point
Right.
0.7 PQ is 70% equals 1. And so that's kind of where that idea comes from, is you're looking at the frequencies in the form of a percentage, which ends up being a decimal, if that
Right.
makes
Yeah. Like if it's not dominant, it's recessive. And if it's not recessive, it's dominant.
sense. Exactly.
If we take both sides of that equation and we square it, one squared is still one. So that's great. And we'll flash back to, algebra and sophomore or junior year of high school where we may have learned binomial expansion theorem, right? And so we'll have p plus q in parentheses squared. We end up getting p squared plus 2pq plus q squared. And so that equation gives us the genotypic outcomes. So p squared represents homozygous dominant, 2pq represents heterozygous, not just PQ, but 2PQ. So really important. And then the Q squared represents the homozygous recessive. And this is a really important concept to understand because I've seen it in exams, and I can't remember which exam it was specifically. I think maybe it was an AMC practice resource, but there was a question exactly on this. And it gives you like the P allele frequency. And it ranges from like 0.35 to 0.65. And like the peak of whatever they were measuring was at 0.5. And I've had a number of students present this passage to me and they're stumped because like there's no trend, right? Like it goes up until you get to 0.5 and then it goes back down. And if you think about what's happening, right, when you get the two variables closer and closer to 0.5, you're actually increasing the frequency of heterozygosity, right? Because not to get into any complex math or anything, but to maximize the value of 2pq, you want p and q to be as close to 0.5 as possible. And so the answer to that particular question was about heterozygosity, right? Knowing that as I get closer and closer to 0.5, that's an increase in heterozygosity. And so I think the answer was, whatever trait or trend they're measuring is maximized with, maximized heterozygosity or something like that.
You're out here giving people answers to the practice exams.
I think it was a section bank question, if I remember correctly. I don't think it was a practice.
Now they're going to get to that question. They're going to already know. They're not going to have to think.
Well,
no, I'm just messing with you.
I'm expediting the review process.
All right, all right. We're going over that right now, so you don't have to go over it later.
Exactly. But no, in all seriousness, and for all I know, I'm completely butchering the explanation of the question. But it's important because like there's a couple of ways you can get this information presented. Like I've seen times where you'll get a relationship, for example. They'll tell you, the homozygous recessive condition is 3 times more likely than the heterozygous condition. What are the allele frequencies? And you'll kind of have to do some algebra there.
You have to plug in. Yeah. The other way that I've seen it a number of times is because we have this equation p squared plus 2pq equals q squared. And this is like, and you said this before, but this is like this is the distribution of genotypes of individuals, right?
Yeah.
So p squared is the homozygous dominant, 2pq is the heterozygous individuals, and then q squared is the homozygous recessive. And so if you think about it, like from a Mendelian autosomal dominant perspective, like anyone with an autosomal or with a dominant gene is going to present in like the dominant phenotype. So if we're talking about P is brown eyes and Q is blue eyes, again, to kind of go back to the same idea that we were talking about before, anyone with P squared or 2PQ is going to have brown eyes, right? I would be a PQ because my mom had blue eyes and my dad had brown eyes.
Interesting label to put on things. That's an interesting label to throw on yourself, but I'm with it. All right.
It's what it is. That's just my life. Q squared is the only like phenotypically different group, right? Because they're autosomal recessive. So you can separate them out from these other two, what would you call that? Like things.
Phenotypes?
Yeah, sure. And so what I've seen before is they'll say like, 9% of the population has blue eyes. What is the
Right.
allele frequency, right? And so you have to say, okay, 9%, that's
Right.
0.9, and 0.09 equals Q squared, right? Because that's the autosomal recessive, or the homozygous recessive genotype is showing up
Yep.
with recessive phenotype. And so you say, okay, 9%, 0.09 equals Q squared. So Q equals 0.3, right? And then you can use that just to walk through the rest of the question to plug into P plus Q equals 1. And say if Q is 0.3, then P has to equal 0.7. And then you have those gene frequencies. And I've seen it multiple times in that sort of a fashion where they'll give you the recessive phenotype and like the frequency of the recessive phenotype, and you can use it to plug into Q squared. But
Right.
like you said, I mean, they can ask you different ways. Sometimes they'll give you one of these variables, they'll give you P or Q, they'll give it to you in some other fashion, they'll make you use both equations. And so you have to be familiar with both and be familiar enough with the math to kind of plug into those equations and kind of work through them algebraically, which is, a pain for those of us that are not math inclined.
Hey, I mean, it's something that you can definitely practice. Like it's
Yeah,
something that you
absolutely.
can work at and improve. Um, Square roots of decimals does get a little annoying. Um, One piece of advice I would give people, take that 0.09 example. You can write that as 9 times 10 to the negative 2. And now you can take the square root of those two terms individually. So the square root of 9 is 3. Square root of 10 to the negative 2 is 10 to the negative 1,
Mhm.
right? And so now you've got 3 times
That's the next one.
0.1, which
Yeah.
is zero point 0.3.
Yeah.
Same
I like
thing works with,
that anyway.
yeah, same thing works with like 0.81, right? You'd have 81 times 10 to the negative 2 gives you 9 times 10 to the negative 1, 0.9. So,
Yeah. And honestly, if you do some of these enough, you start to kind of recognize the patterns. You don't have to do the math as much, but that's where the practice comes in.
right. And I think this applies to obviously everything on the MCAT. Like it is something that if you practice with purpose and intentionality, and especially things that are skill based, like math has lots of widespread applications on this exam, right? Process of elimination has lots of widespread applications on this exam. So, I would wrap up by, reminding our listeners to not just focus on, mastering the content, but practicing the skills that sort of apply across the board.
Yeah, I think the math is one. I think the reading is one, and we don't talk about it all too much, but being able to pull the relevant information out of a passage, especially in the case of car, which is kind of a different animal.
Yeah,
But the principles that you learn kind of training for cars helps you
for
on other
sure.
passages and other sections. And then I think, and this is not something we're talking a bunch about, but as long as we're talking about principles to apply all over the place, um, being intentional with your question reading and your answer choice reading, because I think you can know everything, and if you speed through a question and misunderstand what they're asking or misunderstand what an answer choice is trying to explain, those are easy. I know this is like not exactly what you were what you were getting at, but
No, it's
they're
it's
talking about like
100% valid.
generally helpful things. Like I think that spending time and being intentional about those skills is much
For
higher
sure.
yield than any one topic, right? Because they're things that will apply everywhere, just kind of like you were saying.
For sure. And, take that message to heart, everybody. And, you know, as you study, right, don't get consumed by the information or the content, right? Allow yourself to practice those skills, right? Because skills apply very sort of ubiquitously, right? Whereas content, only really applies to that content. But keep that thought in mind, right? Hopefully that plus, our conversation on genetics today will be of help in your studying. Be on the lookout for that question that I may or may not have spoiled. But jokes aside, we hope you guys found that episode helpful, and we'll see you all on the next episode of the Jack Westin MCAT podcast. Take care, everybody.
Happy studying, everyone.